in my hands here one of the most fascinating, interesting books ever written by any human being ever. One of the most controversial books that was ever written, believe it or not, because when Niccolo Machiavelli wrote The Prince, the church did not like this thing, and they actually put it on the banned list. It was on the Catholic Index, as what they used to call it, of banned books, because this work was the first real attempt that anybody had really known of in that era of a particular philosophers to look at the idea of government from a pragmatic point of view as opposed to an idealistic point of view. Because when Machiavelli wrote, we're talking the end of the medieval era, 1500s, this Catholic Christian ideal of really idealism had absolutely pervaded all thought, because Christianity is an ideal concept. It's supposed to take into consideration the Christian ideals of how we're supposed to live our lives. And Machiavelli goes and he looks and he's like, really? The Christian kings are supposed to be shepherds, gently governing an innocent flock? Really? Come on, give me a break. Show me an example of a totally functional principality where the ruler of that country acts like a shepherd and the individuals of that country act like a sheep. It doesn't happen. It has never happened. People don't act like this. People don't act all idealistically. People go and kill each other. And that's reality. And a lot of people didn't like to face reality. And a lot of times the systems of power that were set up were actually opposed to the idea of violence. And pacifism has had this grip on the Christian mind for thousands of years. And the idea that, we're supposed to love and be kind, but then this king's fighting that king, and these Christians are opposed to those Christians, and we're fighting, and then there's invasions of barbarians, and there's invasions of Muslims, and there's now even invasions of the secularists and the atheists. And it's like, well, for goodness sake, reality just isn't that simple. And Machiavelli said, well, we need to be real, and we need to be practical, and we need to actually, think about what works. And what he did is he analyzed a bunch of history, a bunch of individuals that did different things, a bunch of nations, a bunch of different situations. And he's like, well, this worked here and this worked here, and these are the reasons why. And if they worked here and they worked there and they work over there, then this is what we should be doing. And let's talk about it, because we actually have goals and desires and hopes and dreams as human beings, and we're not going to accomplish them by sitting on a cloud dreaming about angels all day. That's not going to happen. So let's actually go ahead and take matters into our own hands. And the church is like, no, you can't do this. And a little bit of craziness. Now, his book was published posthumously, so he didn't get to see a lot of the controversy that would inevitably swirl around The Prince. And The Prince is, honestly, it's one of the most fascinating books I've ever read. A lot of the things that Machiavelli talked about stuck with me. And I am an incredibly idealistic person. I always pursue the ideal over the pragmatic, what works philosophy. And I think that that's appropriate for me to do, because I believe that the actual ideal will always end up being the most practical choice. And I think that if we ignore pragmatism, we cloud our ability to see what is in fact ideal, because a lot of times we'll hold an ideal as sacred without ever seeing it come to fruition. For example, those that hold the ideal of communism, they hold on to this ideal like it's a sacred right, a sacred truth, a sacred reality. And then every single time they've ever attempted to implement communism, which has a very long and storied history that stretches back significantly farther than Karl Marx. We're talking thousands of years prior. I read about communistic ideals in Plato's works, and you know that those ideals were swirling around in ancient Egypt and swirling around in other places because throughout all time, mankind has struggled with these ideals of sharing and trying to figure out how to balance private property versus community. And it's a very normal human thing to be able to discuss, to want to be able to discuss. But unfortunately, the ideal of communism, whenever it's ever been tried, always fails, and fails dramatically and fails catastrophically. And it has been tried in more cases than I think a lot of us really realize. It's been tried in small scale. It's been tried in large scale. It does not last. And even when it works small scale, it only works for a limited period of time until somebody gets selfish and starts to abuse the system, and that's it. And it doesn't matter how big your group is, if it's 12 people, if it's 3 people, if it's 12 million people, it doesn't matter how big your group is. Every single time communism has ever been tried, it inevitably fails. And that that level of thinking about things in terms of, does this actually work, is extremely important when we're trying to figure out an actual ideal, because all of the ideals that are right and good and true and balanced will always result in a practical, workable product. And if they don't work in real life, then they're not the correct ideal. They may have a portion of the correct ideal. In fact, they're very likely to have a portion of the correct ideal, but there's something fundamentally broken about them. And that's why it's so important to balance realistic expectations, realistic outcomes, consequences, what actually happens when we perform X task, with our ideals, which say that it doesn't matter what the consequences are. We have to believe and perform and act in a particular way, regardless of whatever else is going to come from this action and this interaction that I have with my relational world. And these two opposing ideals have to be balanced. So the pragmatic approach is the end justifies the means, which is the Machiavellian twist on politics. And then there's the ends doesn't matter and the means don't matter. All that matters is intention, which is the idealistic side. And these two ideas have to come together, and they have to be able to be unified in holy matrimony, or else we'll never have a correct understanding of what the true ideal actually is. Because if we believe in a perfect lawgiver, we have to believe that all of those perfect laws are going to work practically. And we say, well, he can make up any laws that he wants. He can make laws that you have to walk upside down on Pluto every month. And, that's just the ideal. And it doesn't matter what we think or want or feel or care. That's ridiculous. And that's not the real world. In the real world, a perfect lawgiver is only going to give perfect laws, because that's logic. And through using our method of inquiry, which we use on this channel, which is purely the dialectic method, where we have to look at, okay, well, practical means, impractical means. We talk about monarchy. Let's go into it. What does Machiavelli say about monarchy? I'm fascinated when I read this. It's part of the reason why I started thinking about monarchy many, many moons ago. And Machiavelli is absolutely fascinating. And I'm not going to go like super crazy into all the different things that he talked about, because, even though it's not a very big book, there's a lot going on here and there's a lot to unpack, and it's absolutely fascinating. But, a little bit of background, a chronology for Machiavelli. He was born in 1469. He was born in Florence, and it's really important when you understand Machiavelli that you understand that Florence was a republic, and Machiavelli was a Republican partisan all throughout his life, which is strange because the prince is entirely talking about monarchies and tyrannies. it doesn't mention republics at all. In fact, actually, like in the very beginning of the chapter of chapter 1, it's, it goes, all states, all dominions that have had and continue to have power over men were and still are either republics or principalities. Principalities are either hereditary, in which instances the family of the prince has ruled for generations, or they are new. And he says here that I shall set aside any discussion of republics because I treated them elsewhere at length. I shall consider solely the principality, developing as I go the topics mentioned above, and I shall discuss how these principalities can be governed and maintained. And that is one of the most fascinating things about a pragmatist, a true pragmatist, which Machiavelli definitely wrote that line, is he said, well, I think republics are the best, but that's just an ideal. So let's talk about practical application of politics. Let's say you have a princedom. Okay, how are you going to make that work? Let's think about this. Let's actually put into play the princedom policies that have worked in the past, and let's avoid the policies that don't work. And each one of these policies comes down to a philosophy, because if you in this particular philosophy, you're going to do these particular things. If you're going to believe in the other philosophy, you're going to do these other things. He has discussions on whether or not it's better for a ruler to be loved or feared, and that passage probably is the number one reason why this book got banned in the first place, because his views were pretty revolutionary in a purely Catholic Christian society. But he was actually appointed and elected as head of the second chancery of the Republic of Florence. And shortly thereafter, he received an additional post as secretary to the Ten of War and Peace. He was a diplomat to France. He met King Louis XII and George d'Amboise, Cardinal of Rouen, in 1500 AD. And he completed diplomatic missions to Caesar Borgia in the Romagna in Rome. He watched Borgia's fall from power after the death of his father, Pope Alexander VI. He went to France. He was on a diplomatic mission sent by Pope Julius II in 1506, and he went and he had a mission to the Emperor Maximilian in 1507 through 08. And this is key to the understanding of the background of the prince, is in 1512, Soderini republic was actually overthrown and the Medici's returned to power in Florence. And this book was basically designed to give Niccolo Machiavelli the chance to get in good with the Medicis. He wanted to use the Medicis in order to unify Italy specifically, and to kick the Franks, out of Italy entirely, because they had invaded, and then there was other issues with Turks, and there was this whole thing going on. And Niccolo Machiavelli was like, we need to use the power of the prince in order to unify Italy, and because Italy was composed of all these different warring city-states. Some were republics, some were principalities, some were absolute monarchies, some were hereditary traditional monarchies. Italy was a mess of confusion and nightmarishness, and then they had the issue of the church receiving all of this power, and Niccolo Machiavelli talks about this. He talks about the cost of giving the church so much power in the 1500s. And a lot of this stuff is discussed, and he wanted the Medicis to rule, and to rule gloriously. And this book was essentially intended to be a roadmap for how to accomplish that. And then in 1513, Machiavelli was actually dismissed from office, and he barely escaped serious punishment. And then he returned to his country place in Saint-André in Percosina. And then he began the Discourses, which is his work on republicanism, his ideals. And he completed The Prince, which is his super pragmatic work. He also wrote The Art of War, which has nothing to do with Sun Tzu, and he composed The Mandrake Route in 1518, which is his greatest literary work. He also wrote The Life of Castruccio Castracani, Castracani, excuse me, and he was awarded the commission to write a history of Florence by the University of Florence. And he actually wrote a bunch of other things. He wrote a comedy, Clizia, Clizia, Clizia. Anyways, it was a staged comedy, and he wrote his discourses and his dialogue on language, and he finished his history of Florence. So he wrote quite a number of books, and he ended up dying in 1527, excuse me. And The Prince was not printed until 1532, so it was published posthumously. So, that's a little bit of background on Machiavelli, but it's really, really important to understand just how much of a Republican he was and how much of a partisan for republicanism, and how much that secular ideal of pragmatism works with republicanism. The ideals that the ends justifies the means is a very Republican thing to believe and thing to do, because ultimately the republic is only governed by the whims of the democratic body of governed individuals. And so whatever actually ends up benefiting the republic in the end, or benefiting the rulers of the republic in the end, is a good, like a big G good. And some real problems with that. And I've got tons of notes here. One day I think I might do like a whole study on the Prince, because it's fascinating, the different opinions that he has and the different insights that he has. And this book actually, like I said, it was banned by the Catholics in after it was printed, and it received basically widespread condemnation throughout all the Christian world. But when the republics began to pop up, it got a different audience with a different set of ideals, an Enlightenment set of principles. And when those individuals started to read it, they were like, wow, this is very practical. And so it actually dramatically influenced people like Sir Francis Bacon and minor writers. In the 17th century, these original views on Republican government really were transformative. A lot of people don't know that, but the pragmatic, what is going to work ideals of the Enlightenment were heavily influenced by this book and its dramatic impact. It was a large stone splashing in that pool, and the ripples went for a long ways and interrupted a lot of things. James Harrington, Francis Bacon, and a host of minor thinkers began to acknowledge Machiavelli's contributions to Republican theory and to political realism. And they ended up questioning the traditional Catholic Christian interpretation of Machiavelli as specifically a teacher of evil and of vileness. And during the Enlightenment, actually, Frederick II of Prussia, at Voltaire's instigation, assailed Machiavelli's immorality, and he began to say that, no, Machiavelli wasn't immoral, this is just practicalism. And other thinkers, including Hume, Rousseau, Montesquieu, and Alfieri, actually ended up hailing Florentine as the first, hailed the Florence and their great literary achievement in Niccolo Machiavelli as the first modern thinker to have exposed the nature of political tyranny. And still later, during the Risorgimento, the period that led to the 19th century unification of Italy, Italians saw the final chapter of The Prince as a harbinger of their new nation. And in our own century, The Prince is now widely regarded as one of the greatest political works ever written, of functional political ideology, and it has been gobbled up by Republican thinkers and Republican philosophers as an extraordinarily complicated or extraordinarily complex ideology that it all encompasses that Republican ideal, which is pragmatism. And that is absolutely fascinating when we read it. So So there's some things that I want to talk about this. Even in this work on principalities, Niccolo Machiavelli made some very important discoveries, because this book wouldn't mean anything at all if it wasn't completely filled to the brim with political and philosophical insight. And he nailed a lot of things, and I think that made a lot of people uncomfortable. One of the things that he said that was that hereditary monarchies are more beloved than any other form of government. He said because a prince by birth has fewer reasons and less need to harm his subjects, it is natural that he should be more loved. And if no unusual vices make him hated, it is reasonable and natural that he will be well liked by them. And in the antiquity and continuity of his rule, the records and causes of innovations die out, because one change always leaves space for the construction of another. And that statement right there is absolute damnation destruction of the Republican ideal, because every time that you institute changes, it leaves opportunity for changing again and changing again and changing again until you end up in absolute tyranny. Whereas with antiquity and continuity, which are traditional values, there's no need to change. There's no room for change. This is the way that we've done this for the past 250 years. Why would we change? What are you trying to do? Destroy our entire culture? You barbarian, get out. And that leads itself to a cohesive, beloved government and people. And Machiavelli noticed this, and he said so, and he got it. And that is extremely important to understand, that a Republican understood that concept and said it, because at the end of the day, Machiavelli just said, whatever works, works. And that is fascinating. And the other thing that really made this book hated in its day, especially because this was essentially the ideals of monarchy versus the ideals of pure pragmatism, was he was the first to recognize that if you're going to go and conquer a particular locality, or if you're going to have like a revolution or something and you're going to go and conquer a people, you have to entirely execute and eliminate the royal family or royal families, or, anyone with a claim to the throne has to be utterly annihilated. So they have to commit patricide in order to be able to take over monarchies. And this principle, which he says here, and anyone who acquires these lands, speaking of principalities, and wishes to maintain them, must bear two things in mind. First, that the family line of the old prince must be extinguished. Second, that neither their laws nor their taxes be altered. And as a result, they will become, in a very brief time, one body with the old principality. And that ideal, no, you have to extinguish them like a candle, it's a horrific idea. You have to slaughter these people in order to be able to accurately, or in order to be able to genuinely govern this land without uprisings, without upheavals. If you're going to go and conquer a place, or if you're going to have a mass revolution, you have to kill the kings. And we saw that this happened everywhere in the modern world, basically, that communism took over. The first thing that they did was kill the kings, and killed the king's daughters, and killed the king's wife, and killed the king's sons, and their grandsons, and their relatives, and everybody that they knew. And they committed these extraordinary exterminatus actions, and the French Revolution being obviously the most dramatic and horrific of all of these examples, where they went and they just, everybody who's a royal, kill him. And they had to do that. Otherwise, the royals could go back and save the people again. And one of the things that I think about from time to time is actually the movie V for Vendetta, and how the movie would have been so much better if V had come and reestablished the monarchy. But that's an aside. Maybe I'll make a fan fiction someday. The other thing that he noticed, and this part followed directly after this section where you have to kill the kings, was this: don't change the laws. He said, but when dominions are acquired in a province that is not similar in language, customs, and laws, it is here that difficulties arise, and it is here that one needs much good fortune and much diligence to hold on to them. And one of the best and most efficacious remedies would be for the person who has taken possession of them to go and live there. This would make that possession more secure and durable, as the Turks did with Greece. For despite all the other precautions they took to retain that dominion, if they had not gone to live there, it would have been impossible for them to hold on to it. Because, by being on the spot, one sees trouble at its birth, and one can quickly remedy it. Not being there, one hears about it after it is grown, and there is no longer any remedy. Moreover, the province would not be plundered by one's own officers. The subjects would be pleased to have direct recourse to their prince. Thus, wishing to be good subjects, they have more reason to love him, and, wanting to be otherwise, more reason to fear him. Anyone who might wish to invade that dominion from abroad would be more hesitant, so that living right there, the prince can only with the greatest of difficulties lose it. That principle right there, he's talking about an invasion of a new country, but that principle of if you want to secure a location from division, from faction, from uprising, from other things, first of all, you have to live there. Second of all, you can't be changing the laws all the time because it ticks people off. And it makes you think that you're taking advantage of them. And so you have to be slow, you have to be steady, you have to live there. And when you're there, as the monarch, you have the opportunity to respond to things immediately. If there's a natural disaster or something, you're on the ground, looking over the natural disaster, directing the efforts of repair of buildings and, diverting water flows and, humanitarian aid and all of the different things that you want to do. And that is very, very, very helpful for those particular events, and it solidifies the relationship between king and commoner. If there's a factious uprising, the king can immediately take action and be there. And if you live in another country, and this is why empires don't work, this is why mega enormous countries really don't work, is because you just can't be there. Now, there's ways that you can mitigate that, but the primary thing that is helpful about this is the tradition and the traditional aspect of this. And Machiavelli noticed this right away. He saw this because it's practical. You can't just go in and change all the laws and tax everybody like crazy. No, keep everything the same, move there, and everybody will get used to you and will look up to you and will love you. And he says that. Oh, and you know what? While we're talking about principalities, Machiavelli makes a distinction. So there's, on this channel, we talk about the cycle, the tyrannical cycle of nations. And one of the things that happens is we get confused about what type of government that we're talking about. So there's, a set number of possible governments. There's your monarchy, there's your aristocracy, your oligarchy, your democracy, your tyranny, and then your autocratic phase. And these are the only types of government that can possibly exist. Machiavelli wasn't as interested in the ideals of all of those different types of governments. What he was primarily looking at was the difference between basically the top three and the bottom three. He said, okay, well, there's monarchy, tyranny, and autocracy. They're all basically the same to me. A lot of philosophers in the modern period did this as well. They were not being subtle enough. They weren't being as precise enough in their calculations so they just lumped all three of those. That's princedoms. And then on the other half, we have our oligarchy, our aristocracy, and our democracies. And those are going to be our republics. And Machiavelli specifically says, I'm not going to treat of any republics here. But in his definition of princedoms and principalities is what he called them. I'll give you a little reading here so you can understand what he means. He says, let me reply that all principalities known to us are governed in one of two different ways, either by a prince with the others as his servants, who, as ministers, through his favor and permission, assist in governing that kingdom, or by a prince and barons who hold that position, not because of any favor of their master, but because of the nobility of their birth. Such barons as these have their own dominions and subjects who recognize them as masters and are naturally fond of them. Those dominions governed by a prince and his ministers hold their prince in greater authority, for in all his province there is no one that may be recognized as superior to him, and if they do obey any other, they do so as his minister and officer, and they do not harbor any special affection for him. So, right there, we get it. This is the difference between the two principalities, and this is one of the big things that I want to talk about today, which is the ideal of the traditional monarchy and the ideal of the absolute monarchy, or tyranny, or autocracy. Autocracy is a little bit weird because it's got its foot in both areas. Aristocracy can be a little bit weird because it's got its foot in both sides. It is what it is. We can recognize that. Moving on. But the ideals of the traditional monarchy require the position of baron, or local lord. Doesn't matter. The actual term there could be count, could be duke, whatever. You have to have your local lords in order to have a traditional monarchy. And he says that's one type of princedom. The other type of princedom is where you have a singular head of state and everyone else in government is in their position at the direct blessing, with the direct blessing of the head. So they can't be in their position without the approval of the head of state. They retain all of their powers and authorities and gifts and abilities to rule, and everything that they have, they get in a derivative form from the head. Everything is top down in this way. And obviously on the traditional press, we prefer the traditional monarchy for an extraordinary number of reasons. One of the reasons is the Machiavellian principle that diverse monarchies, that these separated monarchies, the traditional monarchies, the traditional principalities, if you will call them, are easy to initially invade, but are very difficult to hold, because the people have traditions that go far deeper than a singular head of state. And in a principality, according to Machiavelli, which is ruled by an autocrat or a straight tyrant, the people are cowed. The people do not have the ability to go and make decisions for themselves, because everything that they do is ultimately at the ultimately everything that they're doing has to be approved by the head of state. You can't have traditions, you can't have hierarchies built into your society, because at any point the ultimate head of whatever your state can come in and remove your governor, can come and remove your tax collectors, can come in and remove whatever officials he wants to remove and replace them. So all of those governors, all of those rulers, every single person that is in power is only in power because of the direct insertion of their person into that particular piece of power from the head of state. And what he says is, with these two types of monarchies, that these, and what he gives is this example, when you invade and what happens between the two different systems. He gives an example with Turkey, or with the Turks, the Turkish emperor and the king of the Franks, the king of France. And I'll read what he wrote here. It's not very long, but it's very informative, extraordinarily informative. What he said was, examples of these two different kinds of governments in our own times are the Turkish emperor and the king of France. The entire kingdom of the Turk is ruled by one master. The others are his servants, and dividing his kingdom into parts, he sends various administrators there, and he moves them and changes them as he pleases. But the king of France is placed among a group of established nobles who are recognized in that state by their subjects and who are loved by them. They have their hereditary rights. The king cannot remove them without danger to himself. Anyone, therefore, who considers these two states will find that the difficulty lies in taking possession of the Turkish state. But once it has been conquered, it is very simple to retain it. On the other hand, you will find that in some ways it is easier to seize the French state, but it is extremely difficult to hold on to it. The reason for the difficulty in being able to occupy It is easier. That's critical. It's easier to seize the French state. It is not easy to seize the French state. The reasons for the difficulty in being able to occupy the Turkish kingdom are that it is not possible to be summoned there by the rulers of that kingdom, nor to hope to make your enterprise easier with the rebellion of those the ruler has around him. This is because of the reasons mentioned above. Since they are all slaves and dependent on the ruler, it is more difficult to corrupt them, and even if they were corrupted, you cannot hope that they will be very useful, not being able to attract followers for the reasons already discussed. Therefore, anyone who attacks the Turks must consider that he will find them completely united, and he must rely more on his own strength than on their lack of unity. But, once beaten and broken in battle so that they cannot regroup their troops, there is nothing else to be feared but the family of the prince. Once it is extinguished, there remains no one else to be feared, for the others have no credit with the people. And, just as the victor before the victory could not place hope in them, so he need not fear them afterwards. The opposite occurs in kingdoms governed like France, because you can enter them with ease once you have won to your side some barons of the kingdom, for you always find malcontents and those who desire a change. These people, for the reasons already given, can open the way to that state and facilitate your victory. However, wishing to hold on to it is accompanied by endless problems. Problems with those that have aided you and with those you have suppressed. Nor does it suffice to do away with the family of the prince, because the lords who make themselves head of new factions still remain, and you lose that state at the first occasion. For you are neither able to make them happy, nor are you able to do away with them. Now, if you will consider the type of government Darius established, you will find it similar to the kingdom of the Turks. And, therefore, Alexander the Great first had to overwhelm it totally and defeat it in battle. After this victory, Darius being dead, that state remained securely in Alexander's hands for the reasons discussed above, and his successors, had they been united, could have enjoyed it with ease, for in that kingdom no disorders arose other than those they themselves had caused. But in states organized like France, it is impossible to hold them with such ease. Because of this, there arose the frequent revolts of Spain, France, and Greece against the Romans, all because of the numerous principalities that were in those states. As long as the memory of them lasted, the Romans were always unsure of their power. But once that memory had been extinguished, because of their long and powerful rule, they became sure possessors. Afterwards, when the Romans fought among themselves, each one was able to draw a following from those provinces according to the authority he enjoyed there. And since the families of their former rulers had been extinguished, they recognized only the Romans. Taking all these things into account, therefore, no one at all should marvel at the ease with which Alexander retained the state of Asia, or at the problems that others suffered in preserving their acquisition, such as Pyrrhus and many others. This is not caused by the greater or lesser skill of the victor, but rather by the difference of situations. I read the whole chapter, I told you it was a short chapter, because there's an extraordinary amount of insight in this chapter. It is one of the most fascinating inquiries into the nature of rulership and the difference between the two forms of rulership. So in the first instance, you have your kingdom of the Turks, and all that you have to do essentially is defeat them in one battle, and their entire country is yours. And in the situation of the French, well, they still had barons, because this is before absolute monarchy absolutely wrecked France and changed France into an absolute princedom. You couldn't just defeat the king of the Franks in a pitched battle, which you would have to do as well if you wanted to be able to invade France. But then you have to keep the peace somehow with all of these other barons and lords. And the only way to do that is to kill off all of them and establish your own principality. Meaning that all of the local lords provide a secondary level of defense that absolute monarchies do not. Absolute monarchies, as soon as you've defeated the absolute ruler or the absolute dictator or the absolute autocrat, the absolute emperor type, then you have utterly annihilated that country's ability to wage war. And the reason why is because all persons who are in power are servants and slaves of the one single head of state. But that is not the case in a traditional monarchy. So, for example, if the United States invaded China and Xi Jinping managed to get off his couch and go and lead his armies into battle and was defeated in a single battle and slain, then all of China would immediately fall, because there's no one in China who can muster any authority, no one who has any ability to rule, no one who has any leadership capabilities whatsoever left, because everything depends on the tyrant, on the dictator. And if the United States was able to somehow assassinate him, then the war would be over before it even started. And that's what's so incredibly dangerous about these absolute top-down structures like that, where everything depends on the point. And if you crack that point, the whole thing comes a-crumbling down. Because without his leadership, those generals wouldn't even be able to, they would all be infighting. They would fight amongst themselves. In fact, if you went and assassinated him, the whole country would probably fall apart, and you'd probably not even need to invade. So, but that is not the case in a traditional monarchy. If you go and assassinate the king of the Franks, France has taken a devastating blow. Devastating. There's no lie. There's no misconceptions here. If you assassinate the ruler of whatever particular country you want to invade before you can get in there, you're going to do a tremendous amount of damage. But you haven't killed them. You haven't destroyed France, because they have other rulers who are accustomed to ruling and who have ruled in their own rights and who have lines and lineages and rulerships that are related to the king in many cases, that they have their own lands, their own principalities. Each one of these provinces has to be conquered one at a time. A lot of times they'll, put up and say, well, you know what, we need a new king, and this particular baron or whatever is an excellent general, so we're going to put him in charge and he'll be the next king if there's nobody left in line. And a lot of times that happens, and that's perfectly fine when you have an invasion or something like that and there's no clear line of succession. And that's one of those ways that traditional monarchy can protect itself. It's a natural defensive mechanism. Say if you kill the father of a family, then all of the sons can still rise up because they have power and rights and authority in their own form. But if all you have is the father of a family and a bunch of slaves without any powerful, independent, strong children, you kill that family, well, you can plunder the house entirely because all the slaves are going to run away. They don't want to be there anyways. And they have no authority. And even if one slave stood up and said, "Follow me, ye other slaves," the slaves would be like, "Who are you, bro? Like, I'm not following you." But if the son rises up, then the rest of the family can rise behind him, even if there's factious infightings and other things. It's not a one-to-one exactly, obviously, but the analogy holds pretty well to help us understand how the traditional monarchies end up outperforming the non-traditional monarchies and other forms of improper government. But all we're looking at today with Machiavelli is the principalities. We're not going to worry about how republics rise and fall and other things like that, because that's not as important. What is important is a discussion on traditional monarchy versus other forms of monarchy to this particular episode. And Machiavelli was a genius for 100% sure, and his work rocked the world for a very, very important reason. And a lot of his conclusions are very hard to argue with. They're extremely practical, and practical solutions are very difficult to defeat, very difficult to look at from any other perspective other than, that actually makes a lot of sense. But ultimately, he ends up shooting himself in the foot in a lot of cases, because most of his solutions in The Prince counteract most of the philosophies that lead to his solutions in The Prince counteract Republican ideology. Most of the things, he says that, the freedom, he calls it, under a republic is almost impossible to extinguish. And even if you've had a country subjugated by a prince for 100 years, they're still going to want their freedom, and they'll throw off their princes as soon as they possibly can. And that's a fascinating thing to look at. And the other thing that Machiavelli did that was so utterly destructive is he taught secularism and he taught fear as a powerful weapon. And he wasn't wrong. And that's the horrible thing. It's horrible. But this is why it's so important to balance your ideals and your pragmatism. Yes, it might win you World War II 10 months faster to drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That's practical. The results speak for themselves. They save all these lives. We ended up winning the war significantly faster. But does the ends justify the means? Which is worse, to kill 1 million civilians or to kill 1 million soldiers? The pragmatist will say it doesn't matter. It's all the same. The idealist will say the soldiers, because the soldiers signed up to be there. The soldiers are ready to die. The soldiers are heroes. The civilians, it's like slaughtering sheep. It's awful. And we have to be able to balance both of these, or else we become evil. And there's a reason why Machiavelli was banned for so long. And there's a reason why Machiavelli began to be loved in the modern period, and why his work is so potent and so powerful and so influential in the modern period, because a ton of the principles that he laid down were adopted by the great thinkers of the Enlightenment era, and they dramatically influenced the way that they would govern the world after this point. So we have to think about these things when we look at Machiavelli and be like, let's balance these ideals here, because if we just take it and run, we could end up in a terrifically horrible place that none of us want to get into. But there's one thing more that I'm going to talk about with Machiavelli, because I'm just excited about it. And Machiavelli, like I said, he was a genius. And that is his discussion on weapons and arming the populace. Just one little paragraph here. He said, "Now, there has never been a time when a new prince disarmed his subjects. On the contrary, when he found them unarmed, he has always armed them. Because when armed, those arms become yours. Those whom you suspect become faithful, and those who were faithful remain so, and they become your partisans rather than your subjects. And since all of your subjects cannot be armed, when those you arm are favored, you can deal more securely with the others. And that distinction in treatment which they recognize towards themselves makes them obliged to you. The others excuse you, judging it necessary that those who are in more danger and who hold more responsibility should have more reward. But when you disarm them, you begin to offend them. You demonstrate that you have no trust in them, either out of cowardice or from little confidence in them. And both these attitudes generate hatred against you. And since you cannot be unarmed, you will have to turn to mercenary soldiers." Fascinating bit of philosophy there, and it's applicable in so many instances beyond just the specific example of going and conquering a new territory or taking over a principality or inheriting or whatever you're going to do in the principalities. This applies to republics. This applies to every form of government, every time period in history. If you go and you disarm your subjects, you are telling them that they are worthless. You are telling them that they cannot be trusted. You are telling them that they are a danger to themselves and to you. You are telling them that only you are a real human being, a fully functional human being who can be trusted with the sword. And that is a terrible thing to teach people. It is a terrible thing to believe of people. And it's proven, according to the philosophy that he just laid down, that when you do that, you are going to generate hatred against you. And we're seeing this today in plenty of places around the world that have stolen away the arms of their people. Their people hate their governments, and there's riots in the streets, there's tyranny from the government, and there's unrest everywhere, there's discontentment, there's malcontents all over the place, and it doesn't work. It's a terrible idea. What is significantly better is to teach people to be good. Teach people to be strong. Teach people to take care of each other and then arm them. And when you do that, you will have a firearm behind every blade of grass, as said yon Japanese general at the outset of World War II. You can't take over a country that is heavily armed. And it is even more difficult to conquer a nation that has generals with hereditary leadership, hereditary rights, responsibilities, and powers that can lead their own little organizations, that know how to run governments, that know how to engage in military action, and who have been trained and armed by the king, who have been given these responsibilities, who are trusted to have firepower, trusted to have weapons, trusted to defend particular locations. You know, if you've got, say, for example, let's say, for example, you're in, a situation of France and Germany, and both of them are, enemies against each other or whatever. Maybe they're, just hanging out and doing whatever they're doing, but you never can trust those Germans. I don't know, whatever. And you're the French king, and you say, well, Baron Louis, I trust you. Your locality is directly on the border of this particular, section of forest land between you and Germany. So your responsibility is to be the first line of defense against any German invasion. And I'm going to arm you. I'm going to give you planes and tanks and missiles and bombs and whatever you need, because you are the first line of defense. And I trust you. Train, protect our country. That is going to go leaps and bounds, universes, light years of power in terms of connectivity and trust and relationship building. When you as the French king go and inspect these fortifications, you say, what do you need? How can I make sure that you have enough arms and armor that makes that baron love you? Because guess what? Getting guns for your birthday is awesome. And it gives this incredible relationship of trust, the opportunity to bloom and to blossom and to create these connected pathways of mutual respect and trust and favor between the two localities. It's not that you say, oh, I'm going to take over. No, that's not what it is at all. It's a relationship of, this is your responsibility and we need you to protect your lands and to protect all of France here. And if this is a pain point where, the Germans are repeatedly invading or whatever, I don't know, then we're going to give you as much help as we possibly can. We're going to bring over as many guns and tanks and planes and bombs and whatever you need. We're going to help you out. And we're going to build fortifications. We're going to build a better Maginot line that will actually work, or whatever we're going to need to do in order to be able to protect all of France through you. If you're, as a man, if you're entrusted with a great responsibility like that, it matures you, it grows you up, it makes you into a better person, it makes you strong, and it makes you love the people that trust you. And it makes the people that trust you love you when you do a good job. And all of humanity, but especially men, need to be needed, need to have responsibility, need to be able to fulfill that responsibility, and need to be able to do a good job in fulfilling that responsibility, and need to be able to stand back and look at the works of your hands and say, I have done a good job here. I did everything that I could do. I have gone above and beyond. And when you do that, it provides a sense of fulfillment. It provides an incredible mental blessing. And it makes for a stronger nation. And these principles hold steady no matter where you are, no matter what time period you're in. And that's one of the reasons why it's so insidious when governments try to go and take away weapons from their people, because they say you cannot be trusted. Only I can be trusted. Only the government can be trusted. You, no, you're a terror to yourselves, to your friends, to your neighbors. You cannot be trusted. You're going to go and kill everybody if we give you weapons. When what they should be doing is saying, here is a weapon. It is a tremendous responsibility. Learn to be good. Protect your friends and neighbors. Learn how to be a warrior of truth and justice and goodness. There is your sword. Go, defend us. The man will take those weapons and it will inspire them, as opposed to, you can't be trusted. See all these bad things that people are doing? I'm going to take your guns away. I'm going to take your swords away. It's damaging. It's destructive. Men are violent creatures. You cannot eliminate this from mankind. You cannot. It is impossible. Therefore, if man is violent, figure out a way to channel that violence into goodness. Figure out a way to use that violent tendency, that tendency to conflict, to make guardians, to make soldiers that will protect the people, to make Templars, to make whatever you need to make in order to generate a glorious growth of goodness inside the human soul. That's all I've got for today. Thank you all for jumping on the Traditional Press. If you're still here with me, hopefully I've earned a like. Hopefully I've earned a subscribe and maybe a little ding-a-ling bell action there. I'd love that. It would be awesome. Tremendously appreciated. Thanks for listening. Stay strong out there, guys, and I will catch you all next time.
This has been the Traditional Press Podcast. Thank you for listening, and tune in next time for more traditional ideas and exploration of the why behind the what.